The economy and tariffs. Dan Collins, who has lived in China for some 20 years, gives us his take on the economy and more. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Silver Bullion Television, SBTV. I'm your host, Patrick Vieira, part of the outreach team of Silver Bullion here in Singapore, where we want to help you truly secure your wealth. Dan Collins joins us today. Dan is a former General Motors plant manager and founder of Tyrell Chemical and Medical. Dan has run businesses in China and lived there for some 20 years, and he's going to give us his insights about the economy, business, and tariffs. And we're delighted to have Dan join us once again today. It's time to saddle up and silver up for Dan Collins. Dan, welcome back to SBTV. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Great to be back.
Glad to have you back. It's been a while, maybe a couple years or so, and I have to own up to that. That's my fault. But because of that, would you mind refreshing us with your history and your background?
Sure. Background. My background's engineering manufacturing, originally from Detroit area, Michigan. Lived 20 years in China, still keep a place there now. Ran large operations for Fortune 500s in China. Ran a conglomerate, a Taiwanese company in mainland China. Moved back to the United States about 4 years ago now, and I'm an entrepreneur. I have several companies, including a chemical distribution company, Tyrell Chemical, and I'm starting to invest in a few other businesses as well. Mainly going to be focused around reshoring manufacturing in the United States. So that's what I'm been focused on. I've been busy here down in South Florida.
Okay, no, sounds good. We're definitely going to have to talk about the tariffs. Being in the position that you're in, but before we get to that, you were in China. Started off with GM. You ran a plant, I believe, for Chevrolet. Correct me if
Yep.
I'm wrong. But back then, what was the auto industry in China like at that time?
So I arrived 1998 in China as an exchange student at Tsinghua University, um, and which is kind of their MIT of China. It's very famous in China. Opens a lot of doors in China. If you can say you went to Tsinghua, that's like a big deal there. Great school. I think it's claimed number one rankings. It's basically neck and neck with MIT. But I arrived as an exchange student there. Started working for General Motors at the time. China made less than they made around 1 million vehicles. A lot of those were VWs. They could domestic automotive capacity was almost nil. So they went from I lived through this the what I always still today call the greatest industrialization in the history of the world. China went from 1 million cars to 30 million cars. Not only did they go from 1 million to 30 million, but they went to dominate EVs. They became the world's largest car exporter. If you had told someone China's going to export cars in the late '90s, they'd laugh at you. They couldn't make a decent car. So that's how fast the Chinese industrial technology transformation has happened. So I lived through all that. From the very beginning up until to today.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Here in Singapore, especially when it comes to EVs, electric vehicles, we see a lot of BYD brands or models. Build your dreams, I believe it stands for.
Yeah, I've actually met Mr. Wong, the owner of BYD, years ago. He came in one of our facilities. Didn't even tell anybody who he was. He just sniffed around the equipment. He was trying to learn everything he could. There's another guy there, the guy that founded Geely. People used to laugh at him. He would say, "How are you going to compete with Toyota? You're trying to make cars. This is before Tesla, before the Chinese car makers came up. Nobody could believe you could do a new car company." And he said, "What's a car? It's just basically some glass, two chairs, four tires, and an engine." So he broke it down that simply, and that was the spirit of China at that time. Like you could do anything. So they did, and they do. So yeah, they have become ultra competitive. They're dominating the battery chemistry. They're dominating the supply chains that you need to require to make the battery. And they've leapfrogged the world with the EVs. So 85% of the world's EVs are sold out of China. And from an engineering perspective, people are still stuck between this EVs versus ICE engines. ICE engines are going away. EVs are so much easier to build. They have 25% of the components that an ICE engine does, right? So when you have an ICE engine, think mechanical pulleys, pumps, hydraulic fluids. These are all last century's technologies. Okay, that now it's been replaced. So a lot of people, especially here in the U.S., we're slow on the EV adoption because we have bigger cars, we need longer range. But you can see what BYD and Tesla are doing to prices now. They can push them down. They have that room, and they can make margins on cars that we haven't seen in decades, 20%, 30%. So yeah, the future is electric. The future is going to be a battle between the Chinese EV makers, Tesla, whoever can catch up, and whoever else can catch up. But it's not easy. The Detroit car makers, Japanese, they're really struggling with the transition.
Yeah, I agree. I see it here. In fact, besides the BYD, right across from our shop, our Bullion shop, there's a Tesla
Mhm.
dealership. So these two guys are they're going at it, neck and neck.
Absolutely.
But you touched on the supply chain, so I'll dive into that a bit deeper later on, and of course, ICE means the internal combustion engines for all of us out there. But then you were in China for some 20 plus years and were there as China entered the World Trade Organization and quickly became the manufacturer of the world. What was it like during that time at the beginning? Because we kind of know what it's like today, where it's the manufacturer for the world. But when it was starting off, what was it like?
So yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people they don't peel back the layers of the onion on China. So when we look at the Chinese economic model, it was basically a Soviet model. So I've lived through four great transitions in my lifetime, economic transitions. The first of which, the collapse of the Soviet Union, happened when I was in high school. But that didn't really affect the global economy so much because you didn't have, there were 250 million people, but they never became part of the labor supply, right? Then you had the East Asian miracle. That's a term not many people remember, but you have to, in your neck of the woods, Singapore, everybody probably remembers it. Go back to the 1960s, areas of Asia were as poor as sub-Saharan Africa, South Korea, these places. The East Asian miracle was basically Japan, South Korea, the tiger economies, your Hong Kongs, your Taiwans, your Singapores, export led growth, practical governance, investment in human social mobility. So how this relates to China and the great rise of China is that they were on the Soviet model, which was a failure. It was 100% command and control. Okay, Deng Xiaoping comes in. Everybody knows the story at that time. I don't care if the cat's black or white, as long as it catches mice. And so they took this state-owned backbone, which still exists today. Oil and gas is nationalized, banking's nationalized, heavy industry, um, car industry, some portions of it are nationalized. The electrical grid is nationalized. Everything is very controlled. But on top of this Soviet model state owned backbone, that was one of my first jobs in China. I was at Tsinghua researching state owned enterprises. They were a disaster. I mean, an absolute disaster. On this state owned backbone lies a layer of the world's most competitive private enterprises in the world. Okay, that's China today, and China's gotten so, and that's why it's so big today, it's so powerful. Is this layer of private enterprises? So, what it was at the beginning, it was in when I got there in the late '90s, it was this transition from command and control Soviet model into this private enterprise world, and it was a unique thing to see. I mean, literally the basic tenets of manufacturing China had to learn. And this is only going back to the late 90s. They didn't understand, nobody had a computer. There'd be one computer for a full department. So the sales department would have 30 people and then share one computer. People sat around, did nothing. The overemployment was dramatic. Like people don't remember. I had one of the plants I managed. One of the military guys came in and said, "I have some retired military guys I want you to take on as workers, and asked if we could hire him. I said, sure. How many do you want us to hire? He said 700. Seven? That's more people than the plant had at the time. So there was so much overemployment. But then by 2012, 2010, 2012, you started to see the first labor shortages happen in Guangdong province, shocking everybody. Like, nobody would have believed China would run out of labor. And they ran this technology curve up, just climbing the economic layer of value. And it was not a big deal in the late 90s and the early 2000s. Remember the China trade deficit? Half of that was created by companies that I worked for, which were multinationals. We set up in China. We export back to the US, export back to Europe. That's where half of the China trade deficit comes from. So that wasn't a big deal at that time. But now the US and China are at loggerheads because China's in every space the US wants to be, passing us in EV, competing on chips, have passed us in telecom network gear, 5G. We don't even make 5G. Shipbuilding capacity, they can build 1,000 container ships a year. We build none. We don't have a merchant marine. China's gone global, and they're a massive technological competitor to the United States, and that's what's creating issues in Washington, D.C.
I think you painted a pretty good picture there. And as, let's say, exports grew, China grew, you were there, its economic and political influence grew. And today, when you see all this, let's just say, tariff talk back and forth, well, it's more than just talk. But knowing both countries the way you do, US and China, what are your thoughts when you see these tariffs flying back and forth?
So the tariffs are a disaster at this point. It's leaving us on the cusp of economic Armageddon. And let me explain. I'm actually been a proponent of U.S. having tariffs. Okay, for 15, 20 years. I go back. I've got video out there. The United States. You're in a trade war. You don't know it, and you've already lost. I've been warning that the U.S. has become industrialized. People didn't see this, so. But if we made 9 million cars in the United States in 1970. Last year, we made 9 million cars. Okay. The US has been stagnated because that East Asian miracle model that Japan, South Korea does, they protect their own markets, but they export. Okay. And then China's done the same. The issue is China's just too big to absorb. And so what's happened now, I always was a proponent of the US has to reindustrialize, but you have to do it smart. You have to be able to make cars. You can't claim to be a superpower if you don't make steel. You lose your chip industry. Our car industry was fading. Literally, we would have lost everything, even the car assembly to Mexico. So U.S. had to get some tariffs. But what they've done recently is execute on it so poorly that it leaves us at the cusp of economic Armageddon. And what do I mean by that? Is they took the trade deficits. They put a guy in charge named Navarro, who's an economist. I don't trust economists with anything execution in the real world. So what he did is he took the trade deficits and the tariffs, and he came out with this chart. Everybody saw it, and it's got all these crazy tariffs on it. And China today, as we're talking now, is around 145%. Some goods have gone up to 245%. The problem is that goods are showing up in the ports right now, and they're going to just not get claimed. People are going to say, keep it. Imagine you've got $1 million in a container. It gets into port. Now you have paid $1 million for those goods, and you need to pay $1.45 million in tariff. Okay, customers can't take it. They won't pay it. They're going to just leave the goods. The goods will start stocking up in the port. The Chinese supply chains go so deep in the United States that you cannot, the global trade system today has been building for 40 years, and you can't just change it overnight with the stroke of a pen. That's what's creating this chaos. So you want a little chaos, but this chaos is much, much too much. I've always been a proponent that the U.S. and China need to work together as a G2. Okay, run the world as a G2. We need strong powers to kind of set the roadmap for everywhere, compete on technology and things. But what's happened recently with the tariffs is that we're risking like real physical goods issues. If Chinese good, I always say Chinese goods stop showing up in U.S., every productive facility in U.S. will go dark. They will not have product. They will not have parts for assembly. They will be missing key components. They will go dark. Shelves will go dark. 40% of Amazon today is are Chinese sellers. 85% of the stuff you see on Amazon is from China. So we're about to create a massive shortage of everything, perhaps a hyperinflation. It is not good. It's got I've got real issues right now with the tariff policy. So
I hear people, Amazon, they're calling it Amagon, since a lot of things might not going to be hard to exist there. But you mentioned the supply chains and how deep they run. Could you give us an example on that?
sure, 85 to 90% of syringes in the United States come from China. All the medical tubing, all of the 80% of tires in the United States are imported. Okay, they're not all from China, but they're many of them come from Thailand, from Chinese-owned tire facilities. Literally, if you go down a list of 10,000 products, 80% of everything you touch is coming from China. Okay, and I don't think the Trump administration understands how deep these supply chains go. Most, even Fortune 500s, they all have something. I've talked to several friends today. They manage billions of dollars and buy. They've stopped shipments in and out of their Chinese facilities because no one knows what the tariffs is going to be. They didn't even understand. Oh, when we look beneath our tier one supplier, their bill of materials are from Chinese suppliers. Now they got to pay 145%. So it's causing these chaotic ripples. There are literally, like I said, if you peel back the layer of the onion, almost 80% of everything you physically touch comes from China or is involved in with China somehow. May not be final assembled in China, but the subcomponents, the materials, these types of things are produced in China. I spent 20 years building factories there. I to this day have import millions of dollars of stuff, and I have facilities. So yeah, I see it. Just like I'm knee deep in the supply chain, and I think the Trump administration's goal is admirable that they've come to the table and they look around the world and they just got angry, as they should. The U.S. is deindustrialized. I could go through the statistics. There's a bunch of fake statistics, like we have the lowest unemployment ever, but yet half the country's on a social welfare program. So the Trump administration's come in and flipped over the table of the global trade game in anger, but they're not seeing the layers of it and how sensitive this is, and you cannot change it overnight. You've got to do a step-by-step program to reindustrialize the U.S. And there are so many factors involved. Our workforce has deteriorated to the point the average tool and die maker in the U.S. now is 62 years old. We have the workforce. We have 350 million people. Like, when people say we don't have labor, that's obnoxiously wrong. That's ridiculous. They're all just sitting at home. They're collecting underemployed. They're collecting welfare checks. 350 million people. You have to be able to make something. So you can't, as I said, you can't be a superpower without making stealing cars and technology products. So we're losing the trade war. We will lose the trade war because we don't have the factories. And if you look at our global export profile, China exports high-tech products to us, and we export agricultural products to them. Soybeans, these kind of things. Said it for years, the U.S. economy is becoming like a 18th century economy where we supply agricultural goods. Look around. Ag supplier countries aren't rich. It's the high-tech countries that are rich. You have to be able to produce high-tech goods, high-tech products, and have that technological and manufacturing underpinning to your economy to be successful in the long run. Unfortunately, in the U.S., we've lived off money printing, government spending. A quarter of U.S. GDP now flows through Washington, D.C. It's a fake economy. I've been saying it for years. It's basically a fake economy propped up by housing bubbles, government spending, and money printing. And so now we're coming to the reckoning. We're at that point where it's finally flipped over.
During that time, though, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, uh, at any time, were you thinking, my goodness, there are just way too many U.S. businesses setting up house in China, what are they going to have left at home?
Yeah, I had that conversation many times, but keep in mind at that time I was kind of a young engineer. I didn't have a I eventually would end up running factories and becoming like, executive vice president, things like that. But at the time I would have that conversation with many of my bosses. I'm like saying, because I personally was involved in shutting down, I can't tell you how many factories in the US. So I would do the business case to move it to China. Then we'd move it to China and say, "Oh my gosh, we don't have retirees here we have to pay for. We get preferential tax treatment." Remember, the China game at the time wasn't so much cheap labor, it was tax avoidance. Move it offshore, then you don't get taxed because you run everything through Hong Kong and you recognize your profits in Hong Kong. Okay. And at the time, the US had the highest corporate tax rates in the world. They were up to like 38%. Why would you set up a factory in US? The US deindustrialized itself. Okay. So we set up these factories in China. Nobody cared about the issue that you just brought up. What they cared about was their bonus. I got to do this to get my bonus. So there's no people are thinking that Americans think strategically or something. No, it's they manage quarter to quarter. Do I get my bonus? So yeah, they we closed the plants one after the other, and I set up the plants one after the other. I literally had to set up a new factory in China every 6 months, double the capacity, double the capacity. That's how China's, and that was a lot of domestic growth. It was growing from 1 million cars a year to 30 million. That's you're mainly capturing the domestic growth there. And like you could see General Motors became number one car maker in China at one time. They sold more in China than they sold in the United States. So we became the China market was about setting up your plant for tax avoidance, cheap labor, and capturing the Chinese market. Eventually, that's why they went. They stayed because of the highly capable workforce, highly capable supplier base, and to stay in the domestic market, which is the world's largest by far. I've talked about before, the Chinese real economy is probably 2 to 3 times larger than the US economy. Okay, if you look at every real economic statistic, China is 2 to 3 times bigger. The U.S. GDP is capturing a lot of financial flows and $5,000 hospital bills. But if you look at the real economy, what actually happens? China makes their Amazon stuff, their Temu stuff, whatever, and they make your Amazon stuff. You can't tell me your economy is larger than theirs. So yeah, that's how big China is. It's now, most people that I know that are real experts in China, guys like me, been there for decades, speak the language, involved in business. They all agree Chinese economy's multiples the size of the U.S. right now.
Yeah, and you brought up a great point about I think many people believe China's economy is export driven, but you brought up the point about how a good portion of their GDP now is also internal consumption, how they are
Yes.
actually supplying themselves and taking care of their own economy.
Right. We make that mistake. That's a great observation. We make that mistake in the US. We see everything's from China. We think that's their economy. That's not their economy. Their exports to the US represent now only around 15% of their exports. And China, in terms of exports, they're much less trade dependent than Japan or South Korea or most countries. They're not as trade dependent as people think. And then when it gets into their exports, so I tell people, how are you going to win a trade war against China when everything you buy is from China and their exports are 15%? They can just walk away and say, okay, keep it. Meanwhile, your economy crashes because you're not getting anything. So it's a real own goal to pick a war with China instead of just quietly reindustrialize like what we should have had. We should have had a better plan. We should have had a tariff by HTS code. That's not by blanket country tariff. So because you want to make microchips in cars, but you don't necessarily need to make dollar store items. And so yeah, that's what we've made some big mistakes recently.
I want to touch on your idea, or you mentioned about there should be a G2, China and US. How would that work out by product or hemisphere? Or I mean, in your view, what would be the best ideal situation for G2?
So when you look at the global economy now, it's an interesting. If you look at the top billion-dollar companies, or everything is China or the U.S. Who's leading AI, China or the U.S.? You basically, we're becoming a big country. Technologies are requiring countries that are bigger and bigger, right? So you're not, Macedonia is not going to have a massive AI program. So you've got to be a big country. You've got to have the data centers. You got to have the engineers. So it's basically in like the technology race. It's China versus U.S. No one else is to be found. Europe's not even there anymore. So they're not a power. It's China versus U.S. So recognizing that fact, how can we work together? And stabilize the world, right? We stabilize. How that would exactly mold into a G2, I think it's just with common respect. We work together and we say, China says, okay, US, I understand you're going to reindustrialize. That's fine. Let's work together on a new trade agreement. And the US has reasonable expectations. And I think the US, we just have to respect the world much more than we do now. So we're running around the world with a chainsaw and annoying a lot of people. And in some cases, it's correct. In Europe, why haven't you paid for your defense for 70 years? You can't expect the US to float you forever. So you have a 10% tariff. You can't get mad when US puts on a 10% tariff. So there's a lot of give and take, but I think we've lacked this administration. But and I'm a Trump guy, okay? So when I criticize him, they got the theory right, just the execution wrong. But you go back to the Biden administration, it's just a constant global chaos with the wars and around the world, zero diplomacy going on. So, yeah, we have got to kind of have a reset at this point, stabilize everything. And, some of the people that I would know and work with, we've been pushing this G2 concept, kind of Nixon 2.0, a China US detente. If I'm the United States, I open China back up. I stopped banning their firms. So under the Biden administration, we banned a couple hundred Chinese firms for really no reason at all other than to suppress their technology, suppress their development. You're not going to do that. It's just not going to happen. And you're seeing them now just make massive progress in chips and biotech and other spaces. So, yeah, work together, get the proper trade rules, reindustrialize the U.S. China, the Chinese manufacturing story of the last 20 years is one of the greatest poverty alleviation programs, not only for China, but the whole world. I mean, where in the world, everyone's living standards have come up with Chinese manufacturing. So that's one thing you need to recognize. The U.S. is not going to be able to do that, to replace that. So the G2 is a concept. I think we need a Nixon 2.0. We need U.S. and China to come together. Because even today, you'll see the White House is saying, oh, we're talking with 90 countries on tariff. You know what? It doesn't matter what the U.S. Estonia tariff rates are. The only trade relationship that matters in the world is the U.S. China. It's just the one. These are the two 800-pound gorillas of the global economy. We got to sort that out and stabilize. I think U.S. and especially under the Trump administration is willing to become less militaristic. We're going to be powerful. They want a strong military, but they don't want to do the interfering that's happened in the last 20, 30 years in Washington, D.C., where they're interfering in every global conflict, putting money behind color revolutions, overthrowing governments, these kinds of things. So I think the U.S. has woken up. They're going to be pulling that back as much as they can, but it remains to be seen. So yeah, we're on the cusp of becoming the bad guys here in the global stage. It's just not good because we had so much soft power, thanks to Hollywood and these other things going back 20, 30 years ago.
I guess with what you're saying, we have two choices: compete or coexist. And I think coexist, the way you laid it out, seems to probably be the wiser choice.
Yeah, we have a choice in the US of G2 or G1. And G1 ain't the US, it's China. So at this strategically, we need to think G2. because you're not going to stop China. So that everyone's major trade partner is China. Their technology, recent report of Australia, they did, I think, 50 of the world's most innovative, most emerging technologies. China's leading in close to 40 of them. Okay, within 5 to 10 years, it'll be most of the 40. So you're not going to suppress China. It's futile to do it, and some of these people in Washington D.C. are so disconnected from reality. They don't understand the global supply chains. They don't understand the real world. They're keyboard warriors. They've never stepped foot in a factory, and they're sitting there thinking that, oh, we're going to over tariff China and isolate China to collapse them. It's a fool's errand. It's a complete, there's much greater chance we collapse ourselves. We need to roll over, what is it, 14, $16 trillion in debt in like the next 18 months. I mean, these are scary numbers.
From your perspective, then, from the U.S., live in the U.S., lived in China a good part of your life. What would you say are maybe one or two of the things that people in the U.S. misunderstand about China, and maybe people in China misunderstand about the U.S.?
So I think Chinese know the U.S. a lot better than we know China. Okay, they watch U.S. movies. Many of them travel abroad, so they understand the U.S. better than you think. Their internet is generally free and open. There's a few taboo topics, but in general, they know what's going on. People, I think, in U.S. might think, "Oh, China, it's like North Korea." These are completely different things. China is generally open, so China understands the U.S. I think the U.S. Big misunderstanding about what China's going on, what's going on there. You see these videos now all over the internet. They go to China and look around and go, "Oh my goodness, like what is this? Looks like the future," because everything's new. It's all brand new. It's all safe now, clean. But China does what's best for China, which makes sense. And the Chinese are mostly involved in their world. They're concerned what's going on in China. So what's going on outside China, it comes second to them, to what's going on in China. Now, in America, we have a much more thought process of what's going on in this country, especially our elites, right? Meanwhile, Detroit's becoming deindustrialized. They have no clue, but they're concerned which general's doing this in Pakistan or wherever. And we have a complete foreign policy lens as we view the world, and we're not looking inward. So there needs to be a lot more inward looking in the United States. But now we're banning Chinese students, or there's a talk about it, which is craziness. You want students coming back and forth. You want people to people interaction, because generally, as most people know, as your viewers probably know, I'm sure, that when you get people to people exchanges, everyone's generally the same. We all want the same things in life. We want safe families. We want nice careers. We want to be able to, create a life for our kids. That's what everybody wants. And when you go to a Chinese person's house, they're some of the best hosts you'll ever meet. They want to, interact with you, be friendly. So, and this goes for Russians too, and Ukrainians and whoever. So, it's a lot of times governments and these people working in governments that create problems. So we want people to people exchange. I think China is trying to bring in 50,000 foreign exchange students. The American exchange students, when I went there, I was one of the first groups. Like, there was nobody there in the late 90s. And then the numbers went up, but those numbers have like collapsed. There's just not many Americans studying in China, even though you can get a great education and it's very, very cost effective, almost nothing. So yeah, so I'm hoping to see people to people exchanges, governments to ramp back the rhetoric, and then we try to move the world into this kind of G2 where we can create more stability. Because if you don't have this G2, you're just going to get instability everywhere, which is not good for anybody.
Yeah, great points. It all makes sense. A lot of these last few questions, and I'm glad you went down that road where I believe we all truly do want peace. We all want peace in the world. The question is, will we get it? Because as you were just saying, it seems that governments, they say they want peace and whatnot, but it seems like they are the ones really getting in the way of peace.
There's a lot of people making money from war. That's the facts, and especially in the United States. And it's really a tragedy. So if you look at human history, especially in Europe, every 100 years they go at each other. And they don't even, you could ask, get a group of 10 historians from World War I together. They all have kind of different reasons why the war started. They don't even know really why the war started. They'll all have different interpretations. And this is more than 100 years later. This leads into World War II. You have global chaos unlike we've ever seen. So during the Soviet US Cold War, you had relative stability. You had proxy wars kicking off, Vietnam, North Korea, but you had general stability. Now that the US is pulling back as the global hegemon, we don't have the power to do that anymore. We're not even controlling the sea lanes now. The Yemenis are. So as this power has come back, you can expect more global chaos because you've got these decades of simmering issues boiling up everywhere. That's why you need a strong G2. The question is, even if the US and China would agree to a G2, would China want to be a global stabilizer with military abroad? It doesn't look like it. They're not big into that. They're not, like I said, they're very concerned what goes on in China. That's their world, their orbit. That's the Middle Kingdom. So they may not want to be this global stabilizer militarily like the US has been. So it's getting harder and harder to control the Pax Americana, which we've been under since World War II. That's we're watching in real time as that fades away. A lot of technological changes happening that has contributed to that. You see the drones, you see underwater drones, you see the rocket forces that are keeping the U.S. Navy outside of the key trade zones. They can't even patrol there; they'll get hit. So yeah, we're all living through a time of transition for sure. And where it ends up, nobody knows.
Quick question though, your companies, how are they being affected with the tariffs, or what do you foresee the impact coming your way?
So my company, I supply a lot of semiconductor companies with chemicals, and yeah, it's difficult. There's a lot of complicated chemistry. There's a lot of facilities now that only in China make that. So the tariffs don't affect me per se because I have to just increase the prices because it's all out of China. But yeah, you're running to a point where this global tariff fight internally in the U.S. hasn't been fought yet. So the buyers are saying I'm not paying anything. Suppliers are saying I can't, I can't eat 145% tariff. That's crazy. And so this fight is yet to unfold. It's going to happen now. You're going to get stuff shut down. I like to think of my companies. We're built for chaos. We'll find a way. As I said now too, I'm working with a group. We're trying to bring reshoring back to the United States. We're working at, our goal is to set up 5 new production facilities in the next within the next year, trying to smart reshore where we work at say final assembly, but work with some companies that will reshore production into the United States to bring back a lot of goods that are needed for national security. So keep an eye out on that space. That's kind of where I'm heavily focused right now. So. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and I think those tariffs are now above 200%. So,
Yes, 245% on just one category, which is some medical supplies. But on average, yeah, 145%. It can't stay that way. We will get economic Armageddon if it stays that high. It's got to come back down. If they had just stayed with the 25%, maybe you go to 35%. That's enough to restart, kickstart reshoring in the United States at the product levels that you want: the cars, the chips, the high tech, the engines, the transmissions. We could have had the manufacturing boom would have gone underway. But what they've done with this blanket approach by this economist is a disaster. And you want to reorder the trade system. You don't want to destroy the trade system because it's going to be more difficult to reindustrialize when the economy's in tatters than if you just reindustrialize as is.
Dan Collins, before we wrap up, can you let the people know how they can get more of your views and insights and maybe even the services you might offer?
Well, I'm mostly on. You can mostly find me on X at Dan Collins 2011. I have a pretty good following there, and I mostly just communicate with people from that platform. My companies are all just private companies. I'm not selling anything to the public, so I'm not doing much of that. So yeah, look me up on X, and hope everyone has a great day.
All right. Dan Collins, appreciate it. I hope to get you back on soon and let's see how all of these things unfold. So again, I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Patrick. Anytime. Happy to be back. Anytime.
That was Dan Collins sharing his views on the economy, tariffs in China. To follow more of Dan's views, go to X or Twitter and look for at Dan Collins 2011. If you like this video, please do subscribe, share, and give it a thumbs up. All are greatly appreciated. Audio-only versions of this interview can be found on iTunes and Spotify.